Hello, I'm Dr. Andy King from the Department of History at the University of Southampton. I work on soldiers in the era of the 100 Years' War, on chivalry, on the laws of warfare and the conduct of warfare. And today I'll be talking about some of the factors which shape the way a soldier in late medieval England would have experienced campaign, warfare and life as a soldier. Okay, thank you very much. What I thought I'd do, the soldier's experience circa 1295 to circa 1453 is a vast subject on which I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. What I will do, perhaps not so much about the actual experience, but to give you some idea of the factors and forces, changing forces that shaped that experience, that shaped the soldiers' career patterns, and which were the background against which their experiences took place. Because this was a period in which there was a great deal of change in the way of the armies were organised and the way they fought. And as we'll see, these changes influenced the way that people behaved and the way they experienced war. I should also apologise that I'm afraid following precedents, mine is also going to be a largely Mortimer-free talk. But this is very much the environment within which the Mortimers and their followers would have experienced military service, which was a large part of any noble's life. First of all, a reminder, of course, armies were occasions, not institutions. There wasn't an English army, there were English armies recruited as occasion demanded. And obviously this affects the way that we see how soldiers experience their lives. So when we're talking about soldiers, to a certain extent it was a part-time activity, but again, as we'll see, it becomes increasingly possible to talk about soldiers as professionals, people who earned their living by, if not war, then by military service. The other thing to remember, of course, obviously this will be very familiar to a lot of you, but there are different types of soldiers. The two main categories of which we'll be talking today, and the two dominant categories throughout most of medieval warfare indeed, you have your men-at-arms, the bellatores, those who fought. They were regarded in the traditional way of organising society as the class that fought. So this obviously had a great impact on their self-image. This is an image which should be familiar to a great deal of you. Famous image of Sir Geoffrey Luttrell on his horse, with a caparisoned horse with his coat of arms, on the picture page of the very famous Luttrell Psalter. And this is how he wished to present himself to the world, as a knight on horseback with his coat of arms, surrounded by his family, working in that tradition. It's also a reminder, we've just seen Geoffrey mounted on horseback. As you've just heard, of course, most English armies fought on foot in the particularly in the 100 Years' War. It's one of the ironies of medieval military history. Chivalry, one of the main ethics which shaped military behaviour. Chivalry is derived from chevaux, horses. You could translate it almost as horsemanship, horseliness. But English knights, who were seen as the pinnacle of chivalry, fought on foot. Also a reminder of the nastiness of the business we're dealing with. Men-at-arms were frequently fighting on foot equipped with weapons like this, bills, and the resemblance to a can opener is not coincidental. They're designed to perform precisely that function. This is a view of men at arms trying to do precisely that to each other, to give you some idea of the nastiness of battle. But again, as we've just been hearing, battle was a very unusual part of any soldier's experience in the Middle Ages. If you think of kings like Edward III, Henry V, in their entire lives, both of them fought at one or two large-scale pitched battles in their life, and that would have been very typical for most soldiers in this period. The other class of man, and of course they all were men, we're talking about today is archers. There's a rather pretty picture of English archers at Agincourt, and of course archers were an increasingly important part of English armies through this period. Just to give you some idea of the size of people, size of armies we're talking about, English army, Royal Expedition 1298 to Scotland, led by Edward I, included 3,000 men at arms and over in fact 25,000 foot. So you're talking about a number of men getting on for 30,000, which for the period is huge. Bearing in mind, of course, they would have had vast numbers of hangers-on, grooms, servants, clerks. You're well over 30,000 men in this army, including, of course, 11,900 Welshmen. As one point to bear in mind, I'll be talking about English soldiers. That does also obviously include large numbers of Welsh soldiers, but also numbers of Gascon soldiers, even numbers of Scottish soldiers who were in the English allegiance. So when we talk about the experience of English soldiers, we're actually frequently talking about the experience of Scottish, Welsh, French soldiers in the service of the King of England as King of England, Lord of Wales, Prince of Wales, Lord of Wales, Duke of Aquitaine, Duke of Gascony, large area of the English domains which are ruled across France and Britain. So it's more than just English soldiers. Moving on to the Crusade expedition, you'll notice armies are getting smaller. And this, of course, is before the Black Death wipes out half the population of Europe. Similar number of men-at-arms, 2,700 perhaps, but now 3,250 mounted archers and hobblars. We know these figures because of pay records, which are very good for these expeditions, which is partly why I chose them, and 7,000 foot archers, along with 2,300 Welsh spearmen, but a smaller army overall. And this is a trend which follows armies tended to get smaller, particularly after the Black Death. But it was also partly to do with the increasing professionalisation of armies. You started to get a smaller number of more professional soldiers. So this is the expedition led to France by Henry V in 1415, which ended so spectacularly successfully at Agincourt. Now down to 2,250 men-at-arms and 9,000 archers when they set out from England, but by the time they got to Agincourt, just 6,000, because some of them had to be detached to defend Harfleur, and a lot of others had died of dysentery in the meantime. And it's worth noting when we're thinking about the experience of soldiers, death in battle was actually comparatively rare, much more likely to die of disease or starvation or the cold or any number of everyday causes rather than violent death. Now, to give you, I'm sorry that this is probably a bit small, this slide, but to give you an idea of the sort of range of service a English soldier could see. This is the record of service of Sir Edward Dallingridge, who is sorry, I've just turned the thing off. Oh, that's better. Famous for having built the that castle, Bodiam, which you'll all have seen on the top of biscuit tins. But he built that castle very much on the proceeds of a thriving military career, stretching from 1359 through to 1388. And as you'll see, he served in France, he served at sea in a naval expedition. It's one thing I should also point out, I'm talking about English soldiers. English soldiers actually often served at sea on ships. It's not something I'm going to enlarge about today for constraints of time, but it's worth bearing in mind that there wasn't a clear divide between serving on ship and serving on land. He serves in France again, 1373, 1374 in Aquitaine, Gascony, 1374 again on ship, 1375 naval expedition to Brittany, 1378 another naval expedition, and he also serves in the garrison of Cherbourg in Brittany. 1385 he's with Richard II in Scotland, 1387 another naval expedition on which he didn't bother to actually turn out. And 1388 he was appointed Lieutenant of Brest again in Brittany. So you can see Edward Dallingridge serving across the full range of the Kings of England's dominions, from Scotland in the north down to Gascony in the south of France. And this is a common theme, particularly in the 14th century, when England was fighting wars in France, Spain, and in Scotland on a large scale. A soldier's experience could be, in geographical terms, very widespread. And again, I was talking about him not bothering to turn out. This is from 1370, a royal writ commissioned to John the Law of Canterbury to arrest and bring before the King and Council Edward Dallingridge of the county of Sussex, Chevalier or Knight, Thomas Croppill, Nicholas Painter, John Hawkshaw, John Million and William Ferrer, who, having been retained by Robert Knowles, of whom we'll hear more shortly, to go to the foreign parts in his service, and having received large sums of wages from him, have not gone, and are vagrant in divers parts of the realm, as John de Lakenheath, General Attorney of the said Robert, has certified in Chancery. This is one of the problems which Edward I had in particular, was desertion. When Edward led an expedition to besiege Calais Castle in 1300, he set off with 9,000 footmen and within a month had less than half that number still there, and most of them had simply gone home. This is one thing, of course, when you're attacking Scotland, if you're on an expedition to Scotland, it's obviously much easier to desert back home because you don't have to go across the sea. But desertion was a major problem for Edward I, and it's one of the reasons why methods of recruitment changed, as we shall see, and led to increasingly professionalisation of arms. Because obviously professional soldiers or semi-professional soldiers are much less likely to desert. A reminder again of the extent of military service. Geoffrey Chaucer, famous as a poet and a courtier, actually served under arms for Edward III in 1360. He had a less than glorious military career, managing to get himself captured on what was a fairly successful English chevauchée or raid through France. Now, of course, the traditional way of raising armies was by feudal summons. I use the word feudal, some medieval historians would blanch at that, but in the terms of soldiers who are knights who hold their lands by owing knight service, military service to the king, a specified quota of men-at-arms, which they are obliged to call out to come out with whenever the king summons them. The trouble with this was they were only owed 40 days service, and if you're planning to march across France for 9 months, it's obviously somewhat limited. There's also the problem that feudal dues the knight service owed have become increasingly divorced from the actual number of men people were expected to bring. By Edward I's reign, when Edward I made a feudal summons, for instance, in 1300 to attack Laverock, he ordered people to come along with as many men as they could bring. So you would, Edward I would not have known how many people would actually turn up until they actually turned up. And obviously, when you've got to feed them and decide what to do with them, that makes life slightly awkward. And the other thing about feudal summons, of course, is people aren't paid. But increasingly, it became expected by Englishmen fighting under arms that they would be paid, particularly as feudal service became less important. And actually, it's worth noting that the rates of pay were not bad. A knight was paid 2 shillings a day, which works out for a full year at £36 10 shillings, which £40 was considered a very, very good substantial living. A man-at-arms paid half that, a shilling a day, but nearly £20 a year. An archer, a mounted archer from Edward III's reign on, would be paid 6p a day, or half a shilling. It's £9 a year, and it's worth noting that in this period, an income of £10 a year was considered enough to put you in the ranks of the gentry. So these are quite good rates of pay. The other thing to mention also, if we're talking about soldier experience, one thing they did benefit from in terms of pay is they got paid on religious services, on religious feast days. They got paid on Sundays, which most labourers didn't, because obviously there were labourers weren't expected to work on Sundays and feast days. If you're a soldier, you can't rely on your enemy to be punctilious in their observation of religious feasts, and garrisons have to be paid all year, which means these rates of pay are that much better than they would have received in a non-soldierly occupation. Increasingly, we find armies being recruited by contract, known as indentures, for the reason that the contracts were made in an indented form. The idea was you write out 2 copies of the contract on one sheet of parchment, facing each other, and you then cut a wiggly line down the middle so that both sides go off with a copy of the contract, and if there's a dispute, you can match up the 2 halves and make sure that nobody has written their own contract in the meantime. So it's a means of ensuring trust between both sides. So they're known as indentures when they're indented top. And they set out the terms on which the contractor would serve, the time he would serve for, the number of men, crucially. So it meant that when the king makes a contract with, say, Sir William de Balliol, Warden of Selkirk Forest, 1302, he knows how long exactly Sir Alexander de Balliol will serve, how many men-at-arms he will bring with him, and what that will cost. So it provides a very definite limit to service, and provides information, reliable information on what that service will consist of. It's also worth noting that payment was made would be made to the captain, in this case Alexander de Balliol, to pay his own men. And one advantage of contracting, particularly when you contract a large retinue, is it cuts down on the amount of paperwork for the crown. Because to some extent what you're doing, to use an anachronistic term, is privatising, outsourcing your army. As you'll see, these indentures got steadily more complicated. This is one for service in Gascony or France in 1415, actually for the Agincourt campaign. And by comparison with the previous one, you can see they got steadily more specific and more detailed in their provisions. Just to show you how the system worked, taking expedition to Brittany, 1375, commanders were John, Duke of Brittany, and Edmund of Langley, Earl of Cambridge. The king made 4 contracts with John, Duke of Brittany, Edmund of Langley, Edmund of Mortimer, there is Mortimer in the paper for you, and Edward Lord Despencer, to provide a total of 2,000 men-at-arms and 2,000 archers. So for the Crown's viewpoint, all they had to do was make 4 contracts, and the recruitment of their army was then up to these lords. What happens in turn? So you have Edward making indenture, say with Edmund Mortimer here. Edmund Mortimer then makes additional indentures to raise his men, in this case with a guy called Sir John Struther, who was a Northumbrian knight. He raises 30 men-at-arms, he agrees to raise 30 men-at-arms and 30 archers, and he'll be paid for that by Edmund Mortimer. John Struther, in turn, sub-indents. You see there's a whole series of subcontracts, just as with privatisation today. And he makes a series of indentures with guys to provide him with men-at-arms and archers. So Edmund Mortimer would subcontract his recruitment to a series of knights who would in turn subcontract their recruitment. And so you get a sort of pyramid of contracts. And the pay goes in first instance to Edmund Mortimer. He then has to pay John Struther, and Struther has to pay William Doggett. And it's worth noting we have quite a few of Sir John Struther's indentures, and he paid his contractors rather less than the money he got for them from Edmund Mortimer. So there was money to be made for captains in war from contracting. The other advantage of contracting, of course, is that it's voluntary. I mean, there may be pressure applied to people to make the contract in the first place, but once you made the agreement, you enter into it on a contractual basis freely, and so there isn't the same degree of compulsion, which tends to cause controversy. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is changing methods of war. We've heard a bit about the way wars fought. Jordan Pantame, writing in the late 12th century, wrote, "The way you fight war, first lay waste the land, then destroy one's enemies." Honoré Bouvet, a French canon lawyer in the 14th century, wrote, "The man who does not know how to set places on fire, to rob churches and usurp their rights, and to imprison the priests is not fit to carry on war." He was being sarcastic, I should point out. And ravaging played a major part of these expeditions. The idea was to undermine your enemy's economic base and to destroy their political authority. You could make something of an analogy with World War II carpet bombing, in that it's designed to demoralise the enemy, to destroy the capacity to produce war, or contribute towards the war effort, and to show that their leader is incapable of protecting them. But the point about these chevauchés, these raids, a chevauché is a mounted raid, is they were, again, occasions, and somebody like Dalingbridge would turn up, fight in France on a chevauché, then go home and be MP for Sussex. What you start to get in Henry V's reign, particularly, is the beginning of what you could call a permanent standing army. And this is obviously a big change in the way that soldiers experience war. This is because Henry V chooses to occupy Normandy on a permanent basis rather than simply leading raids through France. There's a few lists of English garrisons in Normandy in this period. One from 1433 to 4 shows that there are 53 garrisons, permanent garrisons, being paid with 751 men-at-arms and 2,400 archers, a total of 3,161 men. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that there would also have been permanent garrisons on the Scottish borders. There had been permanent paid troops in Aquitaine and Ireland, so even in the 14th century there is a degree of permanent institution in garrisons, but this becomes much more the case in the 15th century, when England's main war effort is directed to maintaining garrisons and an occupation in Normandy. And this shows in the career patterns of soldiers. This is the service of Thomas Burr, Esquire, in various garrisons and with various captains, serving solidly in France from 1418 to 33. I mean, he would have gone back to England occasionally, but basically his military service is taking him away from England on a permanent basis, unlike somebody like Edward Dalingbridge. And you probably can't see this terribly well, but it's the service of an archer, Richard Bullock, in France. Between 1426 and 47, we have records which show him at a variety of English garrisons in France, serving constantly for over 20 years. And I think in this context we can certainly talk about a professional soldier. It's worth noting that some English garrison troops actually ended up buying property. Some of them even stayed in France after the defeat of the English in at the end of the 1440s and became French. Particularly those who had married, which some of them did. Again, we see an increasing service by archers as opposed to men-at-arms. Up to 1400, most expeditions, apart from large ones led by the king, tended to have equal numbers of men-at-arms to archers. Up to about 1430, that changes to a ratio of 3 archers to men-at-arms, and from 1430 onwards, goes even higher. You start to get as many as 19 archers to men-at-arms. Partly this is to do with change in military tactics. The use of archers, particularly on the battlefield, is very effective. Partly it's due to the fact that if you're in the garrison, archers are obviously more useful or potentially more useful than men-at-arms, but partly it's due to the fact that archers are cheaper. They're also, by the fact that they tend to be less social standing, they don't have lands in England which need their presence. So, because increasingly in the 15th century, where you're serving in garrisons for years at a time, that's going to take you away from England for years at a time, and it's difficult to run your estates in England from France. So increasingly the gentry of England were unwilling to become soldiers on this sort of permanent basis, because it took too much commitment unless you were prepared to effectively become a professional soldier. So people like Thomas Burr basically became professional soldiers and made their career as soldiers in France. Now, I've talked a bit about pay, but that's not the only consideration which persuaded men to go to war. For the chivalric classes, obviously the idea of war, I mean, it's partly their traditional raison d'etre. We talked about them as being the bellatores, those who fought. So naturally it was obvious that they ought to go and serve their king. But it's worth noting there was no distinction made between the idea of service as honourable and service as being profitable. This is Henry Beaumont addressing his men before the Battle of Juplin Moor in 1332. We should think of our great duty to prove that we are descended from good knights, and of the great honour and profit that God has destined for us, and the great shame which will befall us if we do not boldly prove ourselves in this great affair. Other English soldiers proved rather more concerned about the profit side than the honour side. This is a complaint by Sir Walter Bentley, who was Edward III's lieutenant in Brittany, talking about his men. They are so rich and so laden with tribute that they have no wish to put themselves at risk, but they are not knights or squires, but they are men of little value, and they are never willing to remain in garrisons unless they take for wages 12 shillings a day, 12 pence a day, a shilling a day, and 40 marks, £26, 13 shillings and 8 pence per year for their fees, i.e. they were demanding quite big pay rises. It's worth noting that for men like that, war offered the prospect of social advancement. We heard a bit about the routier before. A lot of these men effectively became mercenaries. This is from a 14th century chronicle written by a Northumbrian knight who had personal military experience. The English captured many fortresses and garrisoned them, and they achieved so much that all Christian people marvelled. And yet, they were nothing but a gathering of commoners, young men who until this time had been of but little account, that phrase little account again, who came to have great standing and expertise from this war. And so the youths of many regions of England came to join them. These English had established themselves on their own account in many parts of the Kingdom of France after this war. They were men who gathered as unknown youths from different regions of England, many beginning as archers and then becoming knights, and some of them captains. And the example of this par excellence is Robert Knowles, who's described in 1358 as a veteran plunderer. He is thought to have started off as he was a Cheshireman who started off as an archer and ended up as one of Edward III's main war captains, contracting directly with Edward III to raise armies. And this is an account by a chronicler in Flanders in the 14th century. Of these captains, I want to record the names of some who operated in the march this side of Paris and the river Seine, so they are not forgotten. The richest and the one who had been at it longest was Robert Knowles. He finished up with around 200,000 florins and some 60 fine castles at his command, and he captured the fine city of Auxerre and pillaged and held to ransom all the surrounding countryside within a 2 or 3 day ride in every direction, and burnt and destroyed all the suburbs of Orleans right up to the city gates, and won the noble house known as Châteauneuf-sur-Loire and installed his own garrison there. When he wanted, he had an army of 3,000 lances or 3,000 horse and foot in his pay and at his command. And you'll notice all of this burning, pillaging and occupation of lands is presented as something entirely admirable. Of course, the most famous captain was Sir John Hawkwood, who started off as serving, he was a son of a tailor, apparently, served briefly in English armies, served Edward III briefly, then served himself as a mercenary captain, and ended up with this rather splendid monument in Florence Cathedral as he moved to Italy and set himself up as one of the most preeminent English captains of his time. The other thing to bear in mind, we're talking about professionalisation, you also get the ironic situation where chivalric values are taken up increasingly by the gentry who choose to portray themselves as knights and as soldiers. This is Sir William Wilcox, who died 1411, who's buried just up the road from where I live, in North Lee. Lovely military effigy, but we know he never actually served under arms during his entire life. So he probably never actually had, well, he may have had some armour, but there's no reason to suppose he ever actually wore it. And to finish with, the example of people like William Wilcox, who chose to become lawyers instead of knights, did cause some concern. This is William Caxton, berating the Knighted of England in 1484. And some, not well advised, use not honest and good rule against all the order of knighthood, i.e. they become lawyers. Leave it, and read the noble volumes of the Holy Grail of Lancelot, of Galahad, of Tristan, of Perceforest, of Percival, of Gawain, and many more. There shall you see manhood, courtesy, and gentlemanliness. And look in later days to the noble accents of conquest, as in the days of King Richard, Coeur de Lion, Edward III and his noble sons, Sir Robert Knowles, who we've just heard about, Sir John Hawkwood, who we've just heard about, Sir John Chandos, and Sir Walter Morning. Read Poisson. Now there's a good advice for you. And also, behold that victorious and noble King, Harry V, and the captains under him, his noble brothers, the Montague Earl of Salisbury, and many others whose names shine gloriously by their virtuous noblesse and acts that they did in honour of the order of chivalry. I suppose the point to end on is that you could be chivalrous and turn a handy profit at the same time. Thank you very much.
In the year 1054 a battle it was set. A lord led his army out to meet the threat. Roger de Mortimer, the first of that name, of that noble family of everlasting fame.